So can I ask you a question about analytically in the discrimination on the basis of transgender status? Since trans boys can play on boys' teams, how would we say that this discriminates on the basis of transgender status when its effect really only runs towards trans girls and not trans boys?
We understand the point, and I think that might be relevant to for example, animus point, right? There were not a complete exclusion of transgender people, there was an exclusion of transgender women. But I think on that piece, this court has never required the whole class to actually be excluded to look at the cases to whether the exclusion of a subclass was.
I'm talking about for triggering intermediate scrutiny if transgender status is a suspect class.
Right, so like Craig B. Bourne, for example, that's the one about the men that couldn't get the 18 to 20-year-olds, right? That wasn't all men, it was a subset of men, and yet the court still viewed that as a sex classification subject to heightened scrutiny. And likewise here, even though it's just transgender women, in our view, that are being barred and not transgender men, that also would trigger heightened scrutiny. And I think there's the Rice v. Cayetano case from 2000. There's other examples of the court making clear that just because a subset of the protected class is being excluded, you still would apply heightened scrutiny.
Another question about the science. So you were talking about circulating testosterone being kind of the marker. Idaho is saying, well, that's not the only indication. There are other, when I asked the question about 6-year-old teams before that, that there are other just kind of genetic hardwired differences, maybe in size, et cetera, that don't have to do with circulating testosterone. Is it your understanding that testosterone is it?
So, and my colleague who will present the argument in the next case, is that the record there was more about prepubertal and puberty. Right. I think that the 5% even is not clear whether that's just environmental or biological, actually.
Right.
But I do think, so there are other things that I think, like height, bone size, there have been some other discussions of this. This is an underdeveloped record, by the way. This needs to go back and have a full trial, except that it's moot. But I think the point there is that, no, I'm not trying to make a point on that. I'm not trying to pretend that I'm going to have a trial when we're not. Yeah. But I think the point is that sometimes counterintuitively, it's like having a larger frame, but not having the muscle and the testosterone to drive it could actually put the person in a worse position. And that's a study that was commissioned by the Olympic Committee. It's footnote 6 of our brief, indicates that actually it could be actually put the transgender woman at a disadvantage if they happen to have larger bones and less testosterone or muscle to drive those bones.
Last question. So below, as I understand it, your client challenged the verification procedures.
Yes.
Except when we were talking about how this might be administered, I understood you to say that it would be by checking testosterone levels, because it would be okay to say, to Justice Alito's hypothetical about the cisgender male who has taken no steps and who is now trans, to exclude that person. But would that be an invasion, would that be a violation itself, or too invasive to require someone to, and maybe not just once, but maybe to periodic testing to make sure that the circulating testosterone was low enough? Why wouldn't that be invasive?
So that's an ordinary blood work that a transgender person would get, and that's why I think it's of the nature of the minimal burdens, like in Nguyen and the other cases where the court has said intermediate scrutiny applies, and you actually can, if there's minimal things you have to do to make yourself fall in the category that we want to keep protected, we can require that of you. But
didn't you challenge it?
Well, that was different actually, because the 3 things that you'd have to prove under the state's novel verification thing would have to be your genetic, your reproductive anatomy, which would require actually like a pelvic examination or examination of someone's, nude area. It would be chromosomes, which would require chromosomal testing. That's not what we're talking about. Or it would be endogenous testosterone. And the reason why that wasn't a problem is not because of a blood test. It's not invasive. It's because it would have required the transgender person to stop their hormone treatment to get back to an endogenous level to be able to show they're endogenous.
Okay, so the distinction between circulating and endogenous.
Right, the point was that was actually in a way, like, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions, but kind of a false requirement for transgender people, because they aren't on their endogenous testosterone when they're on hormone therapy. They're on a non-endogenous medical treatment.